Curses are a somewhat newer aura subtype that focuses on enchanting players rather than permanents. This is an upside in some sense, as it means that they can't be removed by removing the permanent they're attached to. However, curses aren't exactly common, with only 42 curses in the entire game, and most of them don't even have the best effects around. So today we're going to go over some of the best curses in the game and see just how well they've done. Starting us off at number 10, we have Curse of Opulence. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 1 red. It has enchant player and the ability where, whenever the enchanted player is attacked, you create a gold token. Then each opponent who was attacking the player does the same. Gold tokens are artifact tokens with the ability where you can sacrifice them and add 1 mana of any color. This card was printed in Commander in 2017 decks, and the card is designed for that format. There, it not only gives you a gold whenever you attack the enchanted opponent, but if one of your other opponents attacks that player, you'll both get a gold. This does help your opponents, but it also helps you more as long as you're able to attack that player at least somewhat consistently. The amount of extra mana Curse of Opulence gives you has made it an all-star in the Commander format, at least in non-CED contexts. Basically, any red deck that was good at consistently attacking wants to run the card, as getting extra mana is one of the best things you could ever do in a game of Commander. Since Commander is a format based on going over the top of your opponents, you'll need an excess of mana to close the game, which is why the format is filled to the brim with so many ramp cards. Despite this, the card doesn't see play in CEDH, mostly because there's not much attacking going on at the highest levels of the format. This is the main reason why Curse of Opulence is only scraping number 10 on this list. Despite seeing quite a bit of play in casual settings, those are casual settings. Curse of Opulence has never put up results in a competitive setting. So as good as the card is in some settings, it can't be put over cards that have done work in tournaments. Still, the card has seen far too much play to simply be ignored entirely. And at number 9, we have Fraying Sanity. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has enchant player and the ability where, at the beginning of each end step, enchanted player mills X cards, where X is the number of cards put into the graveyard from anywhere this turn. Fraying Sanity is one of the best mill cards that we've seen printed in many years, and as soon as it was printed, it immediately started seeing played modern mill decks. Now, mill has never been a tier 1 strategy, but the deck is more than capable of stealing wins from unsuspecting opponents. The deck uses cards like Hedron Crab to consistently mill 6 cards every turn with the help of fetch lands, or mill a ton of cards out of nowhere with Archive Trap, which makes your opponent mill 13 cards and be cast for free if your opponent searches their library this turn. Fraying Sanity makes all of these cards way better. Sanity was often enough to close out games for these mill decks, letting you deck out your opponent in only a couple of extra turns. Despite this power, the card isn't seen play anymore, and that's mostly because mill decks have received even better support in the meantime, and worse, that support doesn't work with Sanity. Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a sorcery that costs 1 and 2 blue, and makes each opponent exile cards on top of the library until the exile cards have the combined mana total of 20 or more. Against most decks in Modern, this will mill a huge number of cards, as the average mana value of a spell in Modern probably sits around 2. Combining this with all the lands in people's decks, and Laughter will be exiling a huge number of cards. The thing is, since this exiles cards from your opponent's deck, it doesn't work with Sanity. The deck either has to choose between playing a card to make all of their other mill cards better, or playing one of the most powerful mill spells we've ever seen printed. And Laughter has proven itself to be more powerful far more consistently. So as good as Sanity can be, there's just no place for it in the current day. And at number 8, we have Curse of Hospitality. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It has enchant player and the abilities where creatures attacking enchanted player have trample, which means they can deal excess combat damage to the defending player. It also has the ability where, whenever a creature deals combat damage to that player, they exile the top card of their library. Until the end of turn, that creature's controller may play that card and then may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. Now, this is a pretty powerful draw spell. Getting to draw a card anytime one of your creatures hits a player for just 3 mana is a pretty great rate. However, there are a couple of downsides that hold the card back. You only get to draw the card for 1 turn, which severely limits your options. However, the bigger issue with the card is that it only draws you cards from your opponent's library. This makes it a lot less consistent. While getting to draw cards is certainly never bad, being able to choose what cards you're drawing by putting them in your deck does a ton to make your deck do what you want it to do consistently. There are tons of cards you can hit that you just wouldn't want. However, as long as you're hitting threats, removal, or more card draw, you're probably pretty happy. This is why the card has mostly seen play in the sideboards of a few decks that wanted more card draw in certain matchups. If you know what your opponent is on, you can know whether or not you'd want to get their cards or not, so you'll just bring the card in whenever you want some of their cards. The card hasn't had a ton of competitive success, only being played in a couple of sideboards here and there. The card getting onto this list mostly just shows how few curses there really are, and there just aren't 10 curses with a storied history of competitive play. And at number 7, we have Curse of the Bloody Tome. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 2 and 1 blue. It has Enchant Player and the ability where, at the beginning of Enchanted Player's upkeep, that player mills 2 cards. Now, this is a fairly weak mill card, far weaker than Fraying Sanity. So, some people would be a bit confused as to why it's higher on this list than a more powerful card. The thing is, Bloody Tome is a common, which means that it's pauper legal. Pauper being a format made up entirely of commons, so while its power level is lower, it's actually far more useful. Milling 2 cards a turn is a bit slow, but it will, after enough turns, finish the job of getting rid of your opponent's entire library. There are a variety of decks in Pauper that can stall the game long enough for Bloody Tome's mill to add up. Certain decks will play cards like Prismatic Strands and Stonehorn Dignitary in Pauper specifically for their ability to blink your opponent's combat steps. Using enough of these cards alongside cards like Mnemonic Wall and Ghostly Flicker to get them back, you can stall for huge amounts of time. And all of this time, Bloody Tome will slowly be eating away your opponent's library. As far as trying to deck your opponent out goes, this is one of the better cards to do that in the format. However, it isn't quite the best. Cards like Jace's Erasure are just ever so slightly better due to triggering when you draw a card, meaning you can manually trigger it yourself, and because it only costs 1 and 1 blue, and that 1 mana can really matter. Curse of Bloody Tome, unfortunately, is pretty likely to get power crept at some point, so it probably won't see too much more success. And at number 6, we have Curse of Shaken Faith. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has Enchant Player and the ability where, whenever Enchanted Player casts a spell that isn't the first spell they've cast this turn, or whenever they copy a spell, it deals 2 damage to them. Curse of Shaken Faith is one of those cards that's back-breaking in some matchups, and kind of useless in others. If you're playing against an opponent that really likes to cast a lot of spells in one turn, or someone who happens to be trying to copy their spells, the card will end up doing a ton of damage. Just about every format has some sort of spell-slingery deck that wants to hold off for one powerful turn. If you've lowered your opponent's life total enough, they may not even have enough life left to do their plays without Shaken Faith burning them to death. For example, in Pioneer, decks like Hidden Strings combo will often cast a huge number of cards on their combo turn. The deck strategy is to use a large number of untap effects on Lotus Field to make a ton of mana before finally winning the game. However, if you lower the deck to around 10 life before their combo turn and they have a Shaken Faith on them, they'd probably just die before they could gain life off of their Approach of the Second Sun, and likely far before they could cast it a second time to win the game. Now, considering all these attributes, no one will be surprised to hear that the card was mostly used as a sideboard card for various red aggro decks against these very specific decks. However, its use ends at Pioneer. In formats like Modern, there are just better cards for any role Shaken Faith would want to fill. Not only would there be better cards for just dealing damage, but you'd also have access to cards like Mindbreak Trap if you just really need to stop your opponent from comboing off. Shaken Faith hasn't put up too many results so far, but it still has some time left in Standard and can carve out a niche for itself in formats like Historic or Pioneer. And at number 5, we have Overwhelming Splendor. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 6 and 2 white. It has Enchant Player and the abilities where all creatures Enchant Player control have base power toughness of 1/1. And lose all abilities, and the Enchanted Player can't activate abilities except for mana abilities and loyalty abilities. This is a pretty difficult card to play under. The second ability isn't all that impactful, at least against the average deck. However, some decks will be completely shut down by this ability. However, the ability to shrink and take away all the abilities of creatures is pretty backbreaking against almost every deck. Paying 1 mana for a 1/1 with no abilities just isn't worth it, which is why every other 1 mana card, even not particularly good 1 mana cards, have at least some better stats or the ability to make them worth playing. In fact, there are cards like Memnite around where you can actually just get this for 0 mana. Now, if you think about what will happen to any card that costs more than 1 mana, you'll realize just how bad this raid is. Once you have a Splendor on you, all of your creatures and spells are pretty much useless. The only thing holding the card back was the card's high mana value. Paying 8 mana for this effect is just a little bit too slow. Most games, your opponent would have found a way to end the game before you could even cast the card. However, people have found ways around this. The card Emergent Ultimatum costs 7 mana and lets you search your library for 3 monocolored cards and reveal them. Your opponent chooses one of them. You shuffle that card into your library, and then you can cast the other 2 without paying their mana costs. Then you exile Emergent Ultimatum. Emergent was incredibly powerful in Standard and has done some work in Historic in the past. While they didn't share a standard together, Overwhelming Splendor was one of the targets the deck would find in certain matchups where it would basically auto-win you the game. While Splendor could be used in this deck at this point, it's been usurped by other cards in the meantime. Splendor has one of the most powerful effects put on a curse, quite possibly the most powerful, but as of right now, we don't quite have enough ways to cast the card fast enough for it to be good. And at number 4, we have Trespasser's Curse. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 1 and 1 black. It has Enchant Player and the ability where, whenever a creature enters a battlefield under Enchant Player's control, that player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This card is generally pretty weak, but has found a few niches that it could fill. This is another card that's mostly seen play in Pauper. Pauper is a very board-focused format, and pinging your opponent for 1 whenever your opponent plays a creature can really add up. While gaining life isn't always the best effect around, gaining life when your opponent plays a creature matches up really well into a lot of different decks. Aggro decks love to play lots of small, efficient creatures to attack you with before you can set up your defenses. Gaining a life whenever they play one of their threats is really helpful for padding your life total. However, you don't really get value off of this card unless you're putting a good amount of pressure on your opponent. That's why the card is mostly used by aggro decks who can make use of both halves of the effect. Aggro decks love dealing extra damage to their opponent, and the little bit of extra life can often give them the opportunity to untap at least 1 more time and push for a lethal. While Trespasser's Curse isn't really even all that powerful of a card, it's still filled an important role for certain decks. It's worth remembering that what makes a card good isn't what it does in a vacuum, it's what it can do in a certain metagame for a certain deck. And at number 3, we have Curse of the Pierced Heart. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has Enchant Player and the ability where at the beginning of the enchanted player's upkeep, it deals 1 damage to that player. Once again, as this card is a common, it is perfectly Pauper legal. I wasn't expecting Pauper to come up so much on this list when I started writing it, but apparently the higher rarity curses have much bigger issues than the lower rarity curses. Mono red burn is a very viable strategy in Pauper. The deck has access to some of the best burn cards ever printed. Not only do you have cards like Lightning Bolt that staple 1 mana for 3 damage, but crazy powerful cards like Fire Blast which deals 4 damage to anything for 6 mana, but can be cast for free by sacrificing 2 mountains. This is a crazy amount of damage for literally no mana. With all these cards available, you may be asking why you even need Pierced Heart considering it does so little damage comparatively. Well, once again, this is mostly a sideboard card, but it sees fairly consistent play in these sideboards. Sometimes you won't be able to simply burst your opponent down with all of your burn spells. Your opponent will simply have too much interaction or life gain for the burn spells you draw to do the job. However, if you stick a single Curse of the Pierced Heart on them, over the course of several turns, it will end up dealing upwards of 4 or 5 damage. If your opponent doesn't answer the curse, it will eventually kill them. And if you've already lowered their life total enough, this is a legitimate threat. This type of inevitable damage has been powerful on multiple other cards, but in other formats, you need to do just a little bit more for someone to play this kind of card. Pierced Heart will only ever see play in Pauper, but it seems to have a pretty good niche in that format for years to come. And at number 2, we have Curse of Silence. This is an aura with a mana cost of 1 white. It has Enchant Player and the abilities where, as Curse of Silence enters a battlefield, you choose a card name. Spells the enchanted player casts with the chosen name cost 2 more to cast. And whenever enchanted player does cast a spell with the chosen name, you can sacrifice it, and if you do, you draw a card. This is a very nice card for sniping problematic spells. While it doesn't actually stop the opponent from playing the card, forcing your opponent to play 2 more to cast something can be more than enough to completely ruin their turn. While there are other cards that can do the job, such as Meddling Mage, which completely stops your opponent from casting the spells at all, Curse of Silence has a few really important upsides. First of all, Mage is a creature, meaning it can be dealt with the most common types of removal, whereas Curse of Silence is more difficult for the average deck to answer. Curse of Silence also costs 1 less to cast, meaning you get it down before your opponent's second turn going second, or even their first turn going first. On top of interfering with your opponent's plays, when they do finally cast the spell you named, it gives you the ability to cut your losses and try to draw a more useful card for the situation. This type of disruption can be incredibly useful for a ton of situations. If your opponent has exactly 1 out for your deck, Curse of Silence can give you the time you need to close the game. If your opponent is on a particular combo deck, Curse of Silence can push their combo back a few turns. The level of versatility combined with the fact that the card doesn't hurt you in any way, unlike other cards that fill a similar role such as Deafening Silence, has allowed Curse of Silence to carve out a niche playability for itself as a powerful silver bullet against a variety of decks. However, there's one curse that's probably even more groan-inducing, at least for certain players. And at number 1, we have Maddening Hex. This is an aura curse with a mana cost of 1 and 2 red. It has Enchant Player and the ability where whenever enchanted player casts a non-creature spell, you roll a 6-sided die. You deal damage to them equal to the result. Then attach Maddening Hex to another one of your opponents chosen at random. This card is an amazing bookend for this video. We start with Curse of Opulence, a red curse built for Commander, and ended with another red designed for Commander curse. Unlike Opulence, however, Maddening Hex is actually better in a 1v1 setting than it is in multiplayer. Since you only have one opponent, Hex will always attach itself right back to that player, so they have no way to escape its effects outside of removing it. This means that anytime they cast a non-creature spell, they'll take an average of 3.5 damage. This damage can add up really fast, unless you just get really unlucky. Considering that Curse of Shaken Faith's damage was good enough to see play while doing less damage when the player casts a smaller percentage of their spells, you can imagine just how good this effect is. The thing is, if you're the one with Maddening Hex on you, you have to prepare for the worst. While it's possible for Hex to only deal 1 damage to each time you cast a spell, when you're evaluating if it's worth casting a spell, you have to weigh the likelihood of your opponent rolling a 6 against the likelihood of them rolling a 1, and everything in between. This makes finding the correct line much more difficult. The card is only legal in Commander, Legacy, and Vintage, and the card has already proven itself in Legacy and Vintage. The vast majority of decks in these formats will have a really hard time playing against Hex, and some decks just fold to it right away. There are a few too many things like Death and Taxes going around to play to the main board, but the card is a real beating out of the board. Your opponent kind of has to use their counter magic on Hex itself if you cast it, since otherwise it's probably just going to kill them. Maddening Hex would absolutely see play if it were legal in any other format, and would quickly be racking up even more people complaining about how frustrating this card is to play against. There's not really even much of a contest for what the strongest curse in the game is. Alright, and that's the video. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.